This pundit life is a dangerous game. Josh Simons, the director of a think tank associated with the right wing of the Labour Party, discovered the perils of playing reputational roulette last night. On LBC, he had this to say about the government's Rwanda plans.
My main concern with Rwanda is not actually the human rights implications of it and the focus of this report. My main concern is that it's a complete waste of money and it won't work. It won't stop the boats. That was the thing that Rishi said, judge me by, stop the boats. He's failed. Yes. He keeps failing. And meanwhile, he's spending £8 million a day and so far 400 million quid. So my problem with Rwanda is that it won't work. So the hard question is, what you're going to do instead? And I think that while the Conservatives say that they are being tough on the borders and beefing up the policing and so on, I have seen no real evidence that is in fact what they are doing with the kind of commitment and clarity that they need to. I mean, why don't you send the smuggler gangs and put them on the barge that, has been set aside for the asylum seekers to, and then, ship the barge up to the north of Scotland for all I, who cares?
It's rare that you hear someone make a comment that manages to dehumanize both asylum seekers and the entire nation of Scotland. And if I'm being kind, I think what Josh was kind of going for there was a Malcolm Tucker tribute act. Tough, cynical, in touch with the ruthless cut and thrust of real politique. But it just came off as, well, nasty. He chucked human rights out of the window and presented Scotland as little more than a dumping ground for so-called undesirables. Normally, I wouldn't want to stick the boot into someone who's made a tit of themselves on national media because, there but for the grace of God go I. But according to his LinkedIn, Josh Simons previously stood as a Labour candidate. So I don't think it's unfair to say that he's an ambitious political operator, perhaps hoping to build a bit of a public profile and wield influence in the limelight as well as behind the scenes. In fact, this is what he had to say for himself on Twitter just a couple of days ago. Responding to a tweet from Christabel Cooper, he says, "Politics is the art of how the 1% who obsess over politics persuade and influence the 99% who don't." And unfortunately for Josh, his appearance on LBC was generating the wrong kind of buzz. This is a tweet from Kevin Schofield, political editor at HuffPost. A Scottish Labour source says, "I've no idea who he is, but he should fuck off." And here's a follow-up. A London-based Labour source said, "We do know who he is, and we couldn't agree more." So if politics is the art of persuasion, then this is the equivalent of that Spanish lady who tried to restore a painting of Christ and made him look like a thumb. After sharing and then deleting the snippet in question, Josh Simons issued an apology on Twitter. He wrote this. "Following my comments on LBC last night, I apologise for any negative insinuation about Scotland. I'm half Scottish, I love the country, and it is where much of my family comes from. It was a poorly judged comment made in jest and doesn't reflect my views or the views of the Labour Party. I was seeking to draw attention to the immorality of housing asylum seekers who are fleeing persecution on a barge, while smuggler gangs get off free under the Conservatives." Now, I do have a bit of sympathy for someone who comes under fire for communicating something badly. That's absolutely something every human does at some point or another. And for most people, it's just not being broadcast around the nation for people to laugh at. We all make mistakes, we all misspeak, and you've got to give some grace for that. The thing I take issue with, though, is the second part of his apology. Quote, "I was seeking to draw attention to the immorality of housing asylum seekers who are fleeing persecution on a barge." That is categorically not what he said. His exact words were that his, quote, "main concern with Rwanda is not actually the human rights implications of it." He was objecting to the Rwanda policy on the grounds of cost and effectiveness, and explicitly disregarding the actual impact on the rights of asylum seekers. So this is a classic political apology. You're not saying sorry for what actually happened, you're using the apology to try and paint what you said in a more favourable light. But James, am I being harsh here? What do you reckon? Was this a genuine flub that he's very, very sorry for, or a case of trying to walk back something that he really meant?
I suspect he didn't really think that we should be sending people to Scotland. I think that's a sort of daft thing that floated into his head. Exactly as you say, you're going for this sort of the damage, by the way, that Malcolm Tucker has done to sort of Westminster politics is really quite impressive. He's slightly sort of include myself in this description, nerdy characters going around thinking that there's something that they're not is not exactly helpful to the conduct of politics, even slightly, and the swaggering macho nonsense that comes attached to it, not good. So, he's keying into a bit of that. I'm sure the apology, the first part, was pretty sincere to that extent, but you're absolutely right. The second bit, where it's like, oh, actually, wasn't it immoral, really? Well, yeah, it is, actually, and you should, in fact, have said that in the interview, and we'd all be a lot more sympathetic about the whole thing if you have. That is, by the way, not just the presentational part of you have people pretend, too many people thinking they're Malcolm Tucker wandering around SW1, but the issue here is that you have a politics underneath that in which the human rights parts of what we might be doing, the concern for the wider world about what we might be doing, is stripped out, and everything is reduced down to a series of sort of fairly brutal calculations as presented by chunks of mostly a bit of the press here, rather than reflecting wider concerns, I suggest, of the population. And that is what we all have to talk about, and we have to address every question on these terms. This is something that the Labour front bench have done, by the way. They've been fairly insistent about saying, well, we don't like Rwanda because it won't work and it's expensive. Okay, but you really ought to be saying something about the fact that, look, this is just plain old immoral, and this is something that we should be opposing because of that. And actually, this is something a whole bunch of people will agree with you on, and it's a better way of framing the whole question and gets you out of this toxic argument with the Tories about, well, okay, what if we found a really cheap country to send people to instead? It's just not a good way to do the politics. And that's what I think Josh was playing along with here. I'm sure his apology is kind of sincere in that sense, and not just in the sense of, oh dear, he's messed up, I better say something. I think he's probably sincerely thinks he was a bit of a daft thing to say. But you're right, it's the second part of it where he tries to re-spin it back into like, actually, I'm a nice guy, really. It's like, come on, it's a bit of a stretch.
The organisation that Josh Simons represents has a knack for getting very close to power. Labour Together was founded as a think tank in 2015, but after Jeremy Corbyn became leader of the opposition, it transformed itself into an outfit dedicated to wresting the party back from the left. Since then, it has become a vehicle for the party's right wing. This is from Politico. The think tank maintains a low profile in Westminster, but has close links to Labour HQ. Those who run it are in regular contact with senior officials, including Campaign Director Morgan McSweeney, Strategy Director Deborah Mattinson, and Policy Chief Stuart Ingham. It's also doing some serious fundraising, having amassed more than £1.8 million in donations since Starmer became leader in April 2020. The article continues. It also works with a number of other shadow cabinet ministers and their teams. Nearly all the MPs credited with building Labour together since 2017, Reeves, West Streeting, Shabana Mahmood, Steve Reed, Bridget Phillipson, Lucy Powell and Lisa Nandy, now sit in Starmer's top team. We work closely with them to make sure that what they're doing matches up with what Labour HQ is doing, a shadow cabinet minister said. I'll be surprised if they weren't working with the majority of shadow cabinet teams. According to The Guardian, Labour Together's plan was years in the making. Here's what they wrote in October last year. After securing funding from a wide range of donors united in their opposition to Corbyn, Labour Together focused on polling party members to understand their values and attitudes and map out their policy priorities. Its research split the membership into three. Instrumentalists, who would vote for whichever leader would be likely to win the next election and tended to be older and joined Labour in 1997 or just before. Idealists made up the middle 40% of the membership and were often younger and projected onto Corbyn what they wanted him to be. Ideologues rejoined the party to vote for him after having initially signed up in the 1970s and 80s before leaving or being kicked out. The data suggested that idealists made up 2/3 of Corbyn's coalition, the ideologues making up the final third. With this information, Labour Together decided that any successor to Corbyn would need to win over all of the other group, the instrumentalists, and peel off at least a third of the idealists. So, What Labour Together did was get a load of donors to back their work profiling the membership so that they could design a leadership pitch that would get someone into the top job. To do that, they needed someone who would tell the membership that they supported left wing policies and hadn't noisily tried to bring down Jeremy Corbyn between 2017 and 2019. Enter Keir Starmer. What we know now is that all of those left wing policies, the 10 pledges, have turned out to be basically disposable. The Keir Starmer running to be Prime Minister is very different from the Keir Starmer who ran to be Labour leader. This is from The Guardian. Another said, Morgan McSweeney, understood more than anyone else that for Labour to be voter focused and win, the party first had to be membership focused, change the leadership, and then restructure the party. His eyes were always on the prize. Some recall him telling them to stop complaining about the think tank not adopting particular policies because that's not the goal. At the time, Morgan McSweeney was director of Labour Together. What that meant was that it was always the plan to pitch left to the membership and then shift rightwards afterwards. So, James, you were actually a commissioner of a Labour Together report, which was a post-mortem of the 2019 election result. In hindsight, we may be a bit over-optimistic about their willingness to work with the left.
No, not at all. There's a couple of things there. One is that, look, you always, if you're asked to, or you get the opportunity to have the argument for your politics, you should take that opportunity. It's why you get people from Novara, for instance, going off onto GB News or Talk Radio or these sort of more obviously not particularly ideologically aligned platforms that you go and try and deal with. So that's the first bit. You should always try and take these opportunities wherever they're there. Second bit is that the report that was put together, I think is a very comprehensive, very detailed, like it's a really good bit of research, the conclusions of which are basically that what Labour should do to win next time, to cement its lead and to win comfortably, particularly against the Tories as they were in 2020 and onwards with Boris Johnson and the rest, was to do more or less what Jeremy Corbyn did, which is all the popular stuff on increasing public spending, on a big offer on green spending, on doing something about redistribution, making the welfare state work. That's what Labour should be doing. This is what it needs to do to rebuild its coalition. If that report had been stuck to, then at the very least, we'd still have that £28 billion sitting there. There'll be that in Labour, along with a whole load of other left-wing things. Rather strikingly, the report didn't actually get paid much attention by the leadership. And Labour Together itself, of course, is a rather different organisation now. The staff have all changed entirely. Josh Simmons was brought in maybe 2 years ago to oversee the thing. And that 2019 report, with the recommendations, report on the 2019 election, with those recommendations that Labour needed to stick to, the core of the Corbyn programme, has been removed from its website. You won't be able to find it if you go and look on their website now. So the whole thing's been changed. It's been repositioned as a far more overtly sort of Starmerite think tank. I think this causes some problems because one of the things that's very striking about Starmer, the people around him, the politics he espouses, is it's kind of anti-intellectual, right? This isn't really about big thoughts about the state of the world. This isn't like Blairism. This isn't like New Labour. New Labour spent a long period of time trying to grapple with ideas like globalization, what was happening to the world, what was happening to social democracy in Britain and Europe, how Labour's coalition was changing, just big conceptual stuff. People like Professor Anthony Giddens from the LSE as a close advisor to Blair. Who does Starmer have? It's not there. What's his think tank doing? Well, it turns out his director's kind of going in LBC and saying some not very smart things about Scotland and Rwanda, right? So it's not really pulling together in the way that you might have seen in the early 1990s with Blair, with the think tanks around Blair and Brown at the time, much as I'm sure the people around Starmer really want to think that they're simply reproducing what Blair and Brown did. They're not. And I think what's happening with Labour Together is a bit of a symptom of that.